call this a preemptive video response to comments I'm likely to receive on a video that I'm uploading now referencing Barack Obama's recent speech on terrorism, and specifically a reference that I made in the video to Robert McNamara, the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, and a documentary called Fog of War, in which he talks about proportionality in war. Now, I make all my videos sort of stream of consciousness, so it's easy for me to say things, misappropriate words here and there, and say some things that I don't exactly mean, or am vague or ambiguous. And so I wanted to take the time to clarify what I meant there by saying that I think that proportionality in war should be a concept that we should at least consider. And in there I said if proportionality was to be observed, then we might be due for a whole heck of a lot more terrorism based on a lot of the foreign policy that the West has engaged in. I did not mean by that, of course, that this is justified necessarily. All I'm saying is if they were observing, if the people who felt that they're being attacked were observing proportionality, then they've got work to do. And we should be aware of that. But we should also be aware of the proportionality in our response or in our activities overseas. And I'm not sure that's always the case. Now, Robert McNamara in the documentary was talking mostly about the war with Japan, specifically about a lot of the firebombing campaigns, which were massively oriented towards civilian casualties, not to mention, of course, the 2 nukes. And I think when it comes to war, obviously, my position is if your leaders have gotten you into a war, especially a foreign war, an interventionist war, a war of aggression, then they've clearly failed you and should be fired immediately. Defensive wars are, of course, a different thing. If you're going to engage in a war, you should be engaged to win. I don't believe in half measures. If you have to do it, you have to go all the way. And so I'm not saying that proportionality should be considered or should be a component of war when it comes to fighting soldiers on the ground, boots on the ground, or the infrastructure of the war machine of your opponent necessarily. Because if proportionality was to be considered a component of that, well, who's going to win? You would just drive each other down until there's like one soldier versus one soldier, and maybe you could do some kind of a Old West shootout. Not really going to work, a showdown, right? But when it comes to civilian casualties, for sure, and even if you're not going to engage in proportionality in that fashion, the West, particularly the U.S., has had a real luxury there of being able to be the dominant superpower and be able to mostly stave off attacks in the homeland. Most other countries on the planet, not so fortunate. And this is not even to discuss, which we are, but not even to discuss legitimate wars versus illegitimate wars, wars of aggression, wars that have not been declared as wars, wars that are clearly interventionist as opposed to wars that are clearly defense-oriented. And there are many areas where we have acted disproportionately, vastly disproportionately when it comes to civilian casualties. And here, when someone kills American civilians, it's a horror, it's an outrage, it's something that can't be fathomed. But when we discuss civilian casualties overseas, they are collateral damage. And I think this is rather unfortunate because, of course, those people don't consider themselves to be collateral damage. They don't consider their children to be collateral damage. And it's not hard for me to see how someone could become radicalized when they feel like they are at the end of this vastly disproportionate war, not understanding all of the geopolitics involved. All they know is how many of their family members have been destroyed, or in the case of depleted uranium munitions, how much of their future has been destroyed, how much of their lineage has been destroyed. And if you don't know anything about depleted uranium munitions or Robert McNamara and Fog of War, I suggest you research a little bit of that. I recapped the chapter on proportionality today, just to refresh my memory. It's been a while since I've seen that documentary. And the one thing that I was reminded of is that Curtis LeMay, who Robert McNamara worked under for a time before he was Secretary of Defense, actually said after the war that if they had lost the war, they would be tried for war crimes. And McNamara agrees, and he said we probably were. The question I immediately thought before I heard Robert McNamara verbalize it is, what's the difference in the morality, the ethics of the thing if you win or lose. It doesn't change the ethic of the thing. This is the problem with, of course, revisionist history and, that the victors tend to write the history books and that sort of thing. It doesn't change the ethics. It doesn't change the morality of the thing just because you've won. And I think we would do well to heed those lessons. Granted, the war with Japan was completely different than the war in Iraq or the war against terrorists. I mean, obviously, the war in Iraq is a completely separate or a different type of war than the response to Islamic fundamentalist terrorism, of course, or interventions into civil wars and things like that. The difference, I guess, between the Japanese when it comes to the massive civilian casualties and a lot of the Islamic nations is that there is a component of Islam which I guess allows people to respond a little differently. So the Japanese they took the punch and they restructured themselves. They went, okay, obviously we can't be like that anymore. They've kind of been meek ever since. And they've learned how to integrate within the rest of the world in a commerce sense, and they haven't been aggressive since that point. And but they don't have a radical ideology that they potentially can fall back on. When it comes to a lot of the people of the Islamic traditions, there is a lot of discussion in there about an actual holy war, about crusaders, and they are able to identify the Western powers as crusaders, and they've got an ideology that will basically give them carte blanche to do anything they want in response to that threat. And so, again, I'm not saying that our foreign policy is responsible for the terrorism, 1-to-1 ratio, anything like that. And I'm not saying that it justifies the terrorism, although somebody might be able to make the argument. I'd be interested in hearing the moral argument for why that justifies the terrorist acts. But one cannot overlook the fact that it is a contributing factor, that it is causal to some degree. What the proportions are, I don't know. But I think it would be ridiculous and silly to pretend as though, again, as Sean Hannity likes to say, we weren't at war with them, they were at war with us. That's not truthful. And if we don't start being truthful about some of these things, then we're never going to end these conflicts. And I think we have to keep in mind there are powers among us through the revolving door of defense contractors and big government that don't really want to end to a lot of these conflicts. And if you vote for these people, I think you've got a moral responsibility for what they do. I think that's important. And let's not forget, of course, that when you are in one of these other countries somewhere and you see the actions of a government of a democratic country, I think it's not unreasonable to make the assumption that the civilians of that country are on board and they are acting against you by proxy through their government and military arms. And that's not unreasonable to expect people to come to that conclusion. And when you've wiped out their family and you've destroyed cities, I mean, there's some of these cities in various parts of the Middle East have been described to me in terms of what they once looked like as, shining cities on a hill, literally, incredible populate, very metropolitan at one time, et cetera, et cetera. And they've been reduced completely to rubble. They're war-torn. They're just war-torn. And I wonder what we would expect people to behave like who come from those areas. And again, it doesn't mean it's a justification to kill other innocent people, but you have to factor that in. I also referenced in the video John Perkins and Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And I think that's worthwhile. I think that's worthy reading to get an idea for some of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes, the stuff that we're told we don't need to know, that we're on a need-to-know basis, and we don't need to know. These geopolitical attempts, or these attempts to control things geopolitically all over the world, very seldom have positive results as far as I'm concerned. They just foment anger and resentment towards the West. And keep in mind, these people, a lot of them are in a love-hate relationship. They want to love the West because they see a lot of the culture that they try to mimic, and they see the opportunities, and yet the same culture they see as the one pounding them down. So am I saying proportionality should be a concept when it comes to military versus military? Not necessarily, because that's not how you win a war. I think wars need to be legitimate. They should not be wars of aggression. War crimes should be persecuted regardless of who wins the damn war. If we're going to consider ourselves to be a rational species, and I do think that proportionality should be considered when it comes to civilian casualties, especially. Now, I'll end this by saying I don't want my focus here on foreign policy to lead people to believe that I'm somehow desiring to remove agency from Muslims and other people, our opponents, other countries, and that sort of thing. I just want us to be honest about the fact that it is a component, that we can't pretend that it doesn't play a factor. And I believe that other people people are all individually responsible for their own individual actions. I think that in a lot of these countries, people are responsible for their own enlightenment. I don't think you can airstrike people into democracy or airstrike people into an acceptance of the liberty and freedoms due each individual and that sort of thing. I don't think that really works. And the only place where it becomes muddled, and I think what is part of the issue here, the biggest issue, is when you have an ideology or a religion that is shared. And there are fundamental tenets of that religion based, come right from the scriptures themselves, right from the texts themselves, that we're not really having a discussion about. And so while I would agree that individual people are responsible for individual actions, that's why response terrorism, like burning down a mosque or something like that, is not the right action, because you are affecting innocent people who haven't perpetrated any crimes against you, and may not, contemplate anything like that. But by the same token, when you have an ideology or a religion that has specific tenets that the application of is considered the perversion of the religion, then there is more responsibility, I think. More responsibility by the people who would claim to be of that religion, believing in that religion, who are not administering these different pronouncements in the texts themselves, to kind of speak up and say, hey, listen, maybe we need to find another way of differentiating ourselves from these people. And that needs to start with some sort of an admission and a recognition of the fact that it is we who are actually deviating, and have an honest discussion about that. That is extremely important. But ultimately, the people cutting off heads and the people walking around with AR-15s and shooting other people are responsible directly for their own actions. And so I don't want people to take this as some sort of a blame against foreign policy for 100% of the terrorism. We just need to be aware that it is a factor. And that's that. Thanks for watching.